Welcome to this special edition of Students First. I'm Tom Petronio, Communications Director for the Rochester City School District. And on today's program, we're going to examine a very serious issue in Monroe County and in the city of Rochester, that of childhood lead poisoning. Every year in Monroe County, more than 1,000 children under the age of 6 test positive for elevated blood lead levels. This condition can have serious and long-lasting effects on children's motor skills, speech and language, attention span, and IQ. On June 10, 2004, a community lead summit in Rochester was hosted by the Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning. The coalition consists of individuals and organizations dedicated to ending childhood lead poisoning in Monroe County by the year 2010. Joining us today are Patricia Brantingham, Managing Director of the Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning, and Ralph Spezio, co-chair of the coalition and a retired principal of School 17. Thank you both for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's start with a pretty basic question. Why is childhood lead poisoning a serious issue in Rochester and Monroe County? Why should the public be concerned? Ralph?
Well, Tom, a number of years ago, I kind of backed into this, this problem almost by accident. And it really was kind of a unique situation. Throughout my tenure at School 17, we did a number of things to level the playing field. I can tell you that the staff there was just absolutely fantastic. They were hand-picked, and teacher leaders and lead teachers. Probably one of the finest elementary school staffs I've ever seen and had the pleasure of being the principal of. We brought in over $7 million in grants and construction, built health centers and a health center and a dental center. Had a marching band and had partnerships with the Eastman School of Music for stringed orchestra. But we still had major problems with a percentage of children who were just not learning and had real difficulties in behavior and or learning problems. And the more we looked and searched into their history and their CUME record, we found a common denominator. When we looked at their health record, we found that all of them who had serious problems in learning and behavior, all the children had one thing in common. They had a history of high blood lead levels. These children were lead poisoned. And then I asked, what does that mean? And after I found out what that means, we did a study, and we found that 41% of our 3, 4, and 5-year-old children were coming to school for the very first time with over 10 micrograms per deciliter of lead in their blood. These children, according to the Center for Disease Control, that's considered to be permanent brain damage.
And when we think about why does that matter to the wider community, certainly the loss of the productivity of those children, of the entrepreneurship that some of those children would have exhibited, the creativity of those children, that's a loss that we all feel. And it's a cost that we pay. We pay it in Medicaid, because we're talking largely about poor children, and their medical costs are publicly financed. We're talking about special education costs. Ralph can talk more about the real cost of special education for children who are brain damaged. We're talking about juvenile justice system costs that we all pay. So the cost to the community of childhood lead poisoning is tremendous.
So despite the other learning opportunities that you provided in your school and other schools are striving to provide, the damage had been done by the lead poisoning that had already occurred in these children. Is that correct?
Oh, it's astounding, Tom. I mean, with all the work that we did to level the playing field, we still had these major problems with the percentage of children. You know, I've called lead poisoning the silent and invisible monster that's devouring our children right before our eyes, stealing their IQs and therefore stealing their future. This monster doesn't have to be silent and invisible. In this community, we can put a face on this monster, meaning that we can educate people, do primary prevention, and drive this monster, so to speak, right out of town.
And those are things we're going to address during the course of this program. That's exactly the focus of today. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit more about how lead poisoning and high levels of lead in the blood actually affect a child's learning ability. Can you explain a little more in detail?
Yes, Tom. In the course of my own personal education about this, speaking to doctors and speaking to experts, I came across a list of what lead does, the neuropsychological effects of lead on children, lead is a very potent neurotoxin, and it really affects brain development. And I read this list to my instructional cabinet, and I have to tell you that as I was reading this list to them, I had several of them when I looked up weeping, because these are the children often that we are working with, and when you realize the deficits that they're facing, it really strikes home to the heart.
Mm-hmm.
These are what lead can do to children. Delayed language or motor milestones in infants and toddlers, poor speech articulation, poor language understanding or usage, problems maintaining attention in school or home, high activity level, hyperactivity, problems with learning and remembering new information, rigid, inflexible problem-solving abilities, delayed general intellectual abilities, learning problems in school with reading, language, math, and writing. And if I can just pause there a minute. With reading, children often who are lead poisoned have hearing processing delays. So in other words, the phonetic sounds that are required for children to learn for reading, learning to read, often are not heard properly by lead poisoned children. There's delays there, so that there's also delays in reading, learning to read. And the list continues. Problems controlling behavior, aggressive and impulsive behavior, problems with fine or gross motor coordination, learning disabilities, problems paying attention, a disorganized approach to learning, poor work completion, increased risk to drop out, communication deficits, problems sharing and taking turns, increased aggression, and increased need for adult supervision, and that doesn't include the health problems.
That's astounding. So that's basically everything that is involved in a child's development from the youngest age.
Yes.
It's a poison that's adding an even greater challenge to a child's learning than already exists naturally.
And it's
And
insidious. It's absolutely insidious, and it hides so well.
As Ralph said, it's insidious. That means it is very difficult to diagnose. There is no rash that says, I'm lead poisoned. There's no scar that says lead poisoned. It's all of this constellation of symptoms that can so easily be missed. So children who get into school and have these kinds of problems are labeled difficult children, poor learners, but perhaps not so poor that they actually are identified as needing special education. They're borderline children, and they have behavior problems, and so they're labeled bad kids, and then their parents get labeled as bad parents, and their teachers get labeled as bad teachers, and schools get labeled as bad schools, and we're talking about a physical problem. We're talking about permanent brain damage, incurable permanent brain damage from lead poisoning.
And we're talking 1,000 children a year in Monroe County, not just the city?
That's correct.
41% of my 3, 4, and 5-year-olds coming in had a history of blood lead levels of over 10 micrograms per deciliter. And the University of Rochester just completed a study a couple of years ago saying that most of the IQ loss can happen at 5 micrograms per deciliter. In other words, there's no real safe threshold for lead, especially in the window of brain development from birth to age 3, when the brain is really developing, super development there for a child, and also that child is crawling and teething and has natural hand-to-mouth behaviors.
So that's the crucial stage.
That's one of the windows that's very important.
When the child's
Yes.
crawling and in the hand-to-mouth stage as a
Right.
baby.
Right.
Let's talk in concrete terms for what parents should be aware of. How are children exposed to lead, and what should parents know to keep in mind regarding their homes and the safety of their homes?
Virtually all the childhood lead poisoning that occurs in this community is caused by deteriorating paint in homes.
Okay.
There is a level of lead that exists in virtually all homes built before 1978. That's when this country banned lead in paint, 1978. And so even if that paint has been covered over since 1978, and we hope there has been some painting done since then, that lead is still there. And as the paint gets worn away, if it's not well maintained, and we have to be careful to distinguish, Leaded paint that's well covered up, that's maintained, that's not exposed to the environment is not a hazard. It's when that paint deteriorates, when it begins to wear away, and I'm not talking about big chips falling on the floor. That certainly is an extreme case, and it does happen. But lead poisoning, it occurs when there is so little lead in the environment that it's difficult to see. Sometimes we talk about dust, and I worry when we use that word dust because it conjures up images of just bad housekeeping. I think I'm a fairly decent housekeeper, but you could come into my house and you couldn't see on the surfaces that there was dust, but there would be enough if there were lead in that environment to poison a child. So what do? The first thing we do is ensure that if there's any deteriorating paint, and we look first at windows, doors, porches, that is friction and impact surfaces that cause the paint to be worn away. And if there's wear there needs to be repair. And that repair needs to be done using what we call lead-safe work practices. The other kind of lead poisoning that we see in this community is not from deteriorating homes, but rather from those homes that are being remodeled or renovation is being done. And people don't know that there's lead there or that it's hazardous. Take out the Black & Decker, sand down the walls, push out the walls, do what, creating toxic clouds of lead dust. So whenever work is going to be done that is going to disturb painted surfaces in houses built before 1978, lead-safe work practices. And you can find out about that from the Housing Council in town. They teach courses. From our website, www.leadsafe2010.org. Or you can call the national hotline 800-424-LEAD, L-E-A-D.
Okay, great. We'll talk some more about resources for parents and families to make their homes lead safe and practices to make them lead safe when we return from this short break. And we'll also talk a little bit more about where the Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning is going to be heading in the future. Stay with us.
Great.
We will return with more about lead poisoning prevention and much more Students First, right after these words.
Monday morning came too soon. It's entering my
People, let me tell you about my best friend. He's a warm-hearted person who loved me till the end. People, let me tell you about him. He's so much fun. Whether we're talking man to man.
You don't need to be bigger than life to be a good dad. You just need to spend time with your kids. It takes a man to be a dad.
Welcome back to Students First. We now continue this special Students First feature on the dangerous effects of lead poisoning and how the Rochester community can help end the threat of childhood lead poisoning.
Welcome back to Students First. I'm Tom Petronio. With us today are Patricia Brantingham and Ralph Spezio from the Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning. And before the break, we were talking about the problems to children's learning that are caused by lead poisoning. Are there other problems? Are there physical symptoms in addition to learning disabilities that are caused by lead poisoning?
Well, absolutely, Tom, and that's one of the reasons we do say that lead poisoning is insidious and is an insidious, silent, and invisible monster, because there are health issues here too. Generally, children can be affected health-wise with irritability, stomach problems, loss of appetite, and a host of other things. But along with that, there is lead poisoning causes hypertension and problems on the organ systems, kidneys, and all the organ systems. There's hardly anything in the body that lead doesn't affect one way or the other, depending on how much lead is ingested in the body. And part of the insidiousness here is that the body doesn't really it's very difficult for the body to differentiate between lead and calcium. And especially children are especially vulnerable because they're growing so rapidly and their brain is expanding and growing so fast. So that where calcium works with the brain enzymes to really make it work properly, when lead is substituted for calcium because the body has difficulty finding the difference, then the lead makes those systems not work properly.
So it affects the brain as well as other organs.
And actually, Tom, 90% of the burden on the body of lead as we grow up is in the bone system. And of course, again, as Ralph said, it's because of this confusion of the body between calcium and lead. So where the bone would pull in calcium, it pulls in lead if that's available to it. What that means is that as the body goes through its normal growth cycles and pulls pulls calcium from the bone, for example, during pregnancy, that the body is actually pulling lead back into the system to damage all over again the internal organs that were damaged the first time around.
So it's an entirely
It
pervasive
recycles,
problem
yes.
to
It
the
even
body.
speeds up tooth decay because
Yes.
instead of
Right.
calcium being attracted to the teeth, the lead takes its place and then therefore it shows a weakness.
That's amazing.
And there is no level of lead that is safe. Lead doesn't belong in human bodies. There's no naturally occurring lead
Okay.
in the human body.
A study was just done also, Tom, with the University of Rochester showing that the problems are not just limited to children. As adults, there's strong tie-ins to osteoporosis and all other kinds of ailments later on in life.
So it stays with you throughout your life.
It
And
is,
so we pay the costs again. You know, we pay those costs when our children are young and they suffer. And then we all pay the costs in our health insurance premiums, in Medicare costs, and Medicaid costs, because the diseases that we associate with older age, hypertension, kidney disease, osteoporosis, are lead related.
Huge, huge problem here, it sounds like. And we've finally reached a state in our community where we're acknowledging that problem.
Yes.
Hence the formation of the Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning. And your goal is to end childhood lead poisoning by the year 2010. That's a challenging goal, it sounds like. That's that's a very high goal that you've set. How is the coalition and its members from the community working to make that happen?
The coalition believes that, yes, it's a challenging goal, but it's an achievable goal, and that's one of the most exciting things about this work for me. We can win this one. We know where lead is likely to be found. We know how to identify it. We know how to take care of the lead hazards when we do identify them. We know how to prevent childhood lead poisoning. What it takes is the community will to take that action. We recently had a community lead summit on June 10th, and we brought every segment of the community together for a couple of purposes. One, to make sure that everyone understood how big a problem it is and that they had a role to play. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, to get the leadership and the followership, if you will, the entire community to stand up and say, we will do what is necessary to end childhood lead poisoning. And we got those commitments, Tom. We got commitments from County Executive Maggie Brooks, from Mayor Bill Johnson, and from an individual landlord, and from a school teacher, and from religious leaders, education leaders all over the community to do what's necessary. And it's our job as a coalition now to make sure that we follow up on those commitments, that we make sure that where people have the resources to do what they said they would do, that it gets done. Where people need resources, the coalition can provide technical assistance, information, contacts. We want to make sure that all of those commitments get met, because if they are, we will end childhood lead poisoning in this community.
So the summit raised the awareness and garnered commitments from all aspects of the community to not only acknowledge the problem, but to take steps to lessen that problem.
Yes.
Ralph, where does the coalition go from here? There are those commitments. What happens next?
well, you know, it's fun sometimes to stand back at the work we're doing from a distance and take a look at what Rochester is doing as a community. Sometimes we send people to national conferences on lead poisoning, and invariably they come back with treated like celebrities across the nation, because what Rochester as a community is doing for its children and families is on the forefront nationally. I mean, we're really making the path on this one ahead of many other communities across America, and people are looking to see what we're doing. You know, I have to speak from experience here, Tom, because as an elementary school principal, I think I mentioned before that we brought in nearly $7 million to level the playing field in our school, in our community. And I have to tell you that I can't remember once being denied when I went out to this very special community of Rochester and Monroe County. In the name of children, I've never been denied bringing resources back for the children and community. So we live in a very special community that values its children, that has leadership courage and the political will to say that we have to stop this carnage happening to our children, to our families, and to the entire community as a whole. It's a very exciting process. Now, the work we're all doing, we're all putting our shoulder to the wheel on this. We all have responsibilities here. And the work is difficult, but as Patricia says, it's doable. This is doable. We can do this as a community together. One element of the educational system or the churches or the government itself can't do it alone. This is a community project. So we're focusing on primary prevention, education and primary prevention. And I think that with that major focus, along with everyone else doing the policy changes and all the other things that we have to do to inspect the houses and to work together with no finger pointing, but really working together in the name of our children and in our community's future, we can do this.
So the coalition is going to keep working to make these promises become fulfilled and see that the steps are being taken that everybody has stated their interest in making happen.
The coalition really is trying to work as an enabler. We'd like to enable this work to happen. We're the source of expertise with doctors and experts coming together as one group, bringing government together and landlords together and policymakers together. This is doable, and we're making great progress right now. And the thing that's so exciting is that, as Patricia said, that people stood up during the summit and said, this is important. We value our children here, and we value our families and the future of our community. And we're going to work together, and we're going to, as I said before, drive this monster of lead poisoning right out of our community. And we'll be one of the first communities in the nation to do this.
I think that all of our viewers can be encouraged by that, that it is doable to end childhood lead poisoning by 2010 by working together in our community. Before we conclude, let's go back one more time to the parent issue. I know that the city school district itself always has followed strict guidelines for work that's being done in its buildings to conduct renovations and repairs in a lead-safe manner to keep the schools safe and the children protected from the dangers of lead. What can parents do to protect their children at home? And then as a follow-up to that, what resources are available to parents that we can refer them to?
We would tell parents, first of all, to understand their own homes. Was it built before 1978? If it was, and most houses in the city were, if it was built before 1978, there's a high probability there's lead in there somewhere. So look for deteriorating lead. Look in the window wells. If there are little chips of paint, little debris in the window wells, you may have a problem. The only way to know for sure, and this is unfortunate, but it's true, the only way to know for sure is to have a professional come in and do a lead risk assessment. And you can find people to do that in the yellow pages under lead. That's how you'll know if you actually have a hazardous condition. Things that parents can do in the meantime. First of all, when you clean, clean wet. I don't mean, buckets of water on the floor, but we need to keep that lead particle, that dust, from getting out into the atmosphere. So cleaning with a damp cloth instead of a dry cloth, with a mop instead of a dry duster. Those are important things to do when cleaning. For our children, we need to, especially toddlers, this is mostly a problem of children who are in that natural exploring on the floor stage and putting hands in mouth. That means frequent hand washing, frequent toy washing with soap and water. And finally, to make sure that our children have a diet that is very high in calcium and iron. As Ralph said, the body cannot tell the difference between calcium and lead. If there's enough calcium, the absorption of lead will be reduced.
And that would mean milk, what other things?
Milk, meats, leafy green vegetables, those are the products that we like.
So basically a balanced
A
diet goes a long way.
A good diet and a regular steady diet of these good calcium-rich, iron-rich foods.
Those are really simple,
Yes.
easy to take measures that families can do.
We can all do that, and that will help protect our children.
And having babies tested for lead in their blood at what ages is recommended?
It is required in New York State. Not everyone knows this, and not every physician follows this rule, but in fact it's a state law that children are tested for lead at age 1 and again at age 2. So if parents aren't sure, if your parent isn't sure whether that child has been tested, ask the pediatrician. And if the pediatrician says, oh, we don't worry about that anymore, no. Yes, we do worry about that. Okay. Parents should insist that their children be tested at 1 and again at age 2.
Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning, once again, has a website with a range of resources and information that anyone can access, and the address again is www.leadsafeby2010.org. And there's also a phone number people can call, 256-2292. That's the Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning. Great. And I'd like to thank Ralph Spezio, Patricia Brantingham for being here with us today to discuss this problem and provide our viewers with some avenues to minimize the problem and eventually eliminate it in our community. Thank you both.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Join us again on Students First next time. Thank you.
In addition to working with the Rochester Coalition to Prevent Lead Poisoning, the City School District is also working to ensure the safety of drinking water in its elementary schools. In voluntary partnership with the Environmental Protection Agency and the Monroe County Health Department, the district tested the water from more than 1,000 taps and drinking fountains. The majority met federal guidelines. 80 did not. These were immediately shut off and will not be turned back on until the problem is corrected and the water retested and approved. Lead in drinking water contributes minimally to lead levels in children. However, the district chose to undergo testing to remove this factor completely from its elementary schools. For more information on reducing lead in our community, visit www.leadsafeby2010.org.